there are any. And I'm very happy to say, before a final word, that we are almost 100 people here. I'm very glad that there's interest in our enterprise. So, Ryan?
That's maybe one of the other benefits of the new situation, is that it's easy for people to come and attend these things. And perhaps we'll see at the end, it's also easy for people to ask questions honestly, maybe, because they don't have to raise their hand in a crowded lecture hall. They can just drop questions into a chat box. So we'll see perhaps afterwards. Thank you very much, Stefan, and the rest of your team for inviting me and for the lovely introduction. And I certainly think we're on the same page, I guess, to use another English phrase, about the importance of history, or the historical perspective, perhaps, to make meaningful work. And I certainly see that in what you guys are planning to do this semester. So I'm looking forward also to seeing what you guys produce and being in reviews later, and how we can both talk about this kind of idea of looking forward and looking back at the same time. So I'm going to see if I can share here. We'll see. It says that you'll have to enable that, Stefan. You have to enable my ability to screen share.
I have just done that. Yes.
Cool. So let's see if and how this works. Okay, presuming you can all see that, sort of. If you don't mind, I'll probably start with a sort of preamble, I guess, talking a little bit about that philosophy of the practice that Stefan referred to, sort of setting out the framework under which we work. And sorry, somebody has a mic on, so I'm hearing an echo of myself. So if everyone could just check their mics. Not to name names, but maybe it's Diana. So yeah, so if I could just maybe start by setting out the framework, and I might read a little bit in the beginning, and then I'll likely ramble a lot towards the end. So, so first of all, a kind of framework for how we work. All of the work that I show today begins quite simply, really, with the idea that our buildings should be for and about the places they are made, and that they should attempt to communicate with and be meaningful to our clients and their communities. In short, I'm interested in local buildings for local people. And clearly, this is not the most radical opening proposition you've ever seen at the beginning of a lecture. However, I think for practicing architects, it's an ethical approach. And achieving this kind of simple idea or simple statements does require a lot of interrogation. Firstly, it seems clear to me that achieving the latter requires some degree of the former. That is, that making a building which is meaningful to clients and their community is more directly and powerfully achieved if it is somehow arises from, or refers to, or grows out of their local built landscape. I think we architects tend to rely too much on the uniqueness or the difference of our buildings for emotive effect or for artistic integrity, when in fact, I think familiarity can be a much more powerful origin or for a basis for communication. So there are two types of ideas, I think, which are central to this idea of communication for me. And they are type and an idea I call building culture. So first on type, part of architecture's ability to be meaningful and to communicate arises because it shares some characteristics with a language. And perhaps a language metaphor is useful here without maybe getting into the world of semantics and structuralism. I think it is fair to say that in order to understand a language, for it to bear meaning, we must understand its rules and its vocabulary, i.e. the parts and how they usually come together. The languages of architecture, like any language, have common elements which occur repeatedly and relate to each other in predictable ways. One way of thinking about these common elements is through the lens of type. But I'm really interested in thinking quite broadly about type, where it includes not just programs and forms, like church type, for instance, but it also might incorporate constructions or structural types or landscape types. So really a kind of broad definition of typology. Categorization is an inevitable result of language, as the very act of naming something implies belonging to a class of similar things, or at least the possibility of things with similar characteristics. Thus, when one studies buildings and names them or their parts, such as basilica or gable or platform frame or half timber, a type of architectural object or construction arises that relates to other similar objects. Therefore, one might argue that this categorization, that these types are central to architecture's ability to communicate, central to architecture as a language. The type somehow is the vocabulary of architecture. Of course, the question is, what language shall we speak? And today, I think there is this kind of persistent lure towards the international and towards the global all the time. That therefore, much architectural language tends towards maybe universal language, or a language which is intensely personal, belonging only to the architect. And I really think that both of these poles need to be resisted, since they both tend towards a sort of egocentrism and towards maybe a kind of alienation of people who use the buildings. So for me, since the focus of our work is on our clients and the people who surround these buildings, in order for our work to be meaningful, I really think that our buildings must speak a local language, that my work in Ireland cannot speak Romanian. So in order for our buildings to arise from a local language, we must study very closely what I refer to as the local building culture. And by building culture, I mean not simply the kind of high culture of architecture with a capital A or art, but the ordinary day-to-day culture of building. This is the culture that produces the everyday built environment, the daily interactions between builders and clients and the building industry and material availability and banks and laws and the environment, all these things which come together to make every single building in any time. But all of these elements are inevitably tempered by the place they are in and by, of course, the time they're taking place. They're all tempered by the local. So it is the building culture in any place and time that defines the character of that place, far more so than any one architect. So we see, of course, two examples of that on the screen right now. We see a kind of classic Italian hillside, which is really, its character evolves from that complex interaction of all of these ordinary day-to-day things which give it that character, which is in a way the same as, not the character is not the same, but the fact that suburban America looks like this is the result of its building culture. So that's why I say 1950s houses in Romania, I'm sure, are very different than 1950s houses in Ireland. And really importantly, I think that where valuable building cultures are found, that they should be supported by architects and not eroded by architects. So to link these two first ideas, we could say, in short, that local building cultures cultivate local types, local language in the broad sense. And these types range from the very general to the specific and are often layered into one single object. So for example, within the broad type of a kind of single family house, which we might talk about as a kind of use type, we may also define subtypes of the gable end house. We might talk about the blockwork wall being a construction type. We might talk about the rural or suburban site being in a kind of typological way. Each of these types, or thinking about them within these frameworks or references, has the potential for a deep connection through the past to other precedent types, essentially, through numerous antecedents, because as we know that cultures evolve, really, they're not invented. So seen through this lens, any ordinary building of any region in any time can embody and reflect a whole interconnected system of building culture and can refer to many previous building cultures in that place. So all of our work is based in this kind of study of the morphologies of local type vis-a-vis local building culture. And I like to think about this interaction between our work and its local context as one which seeks out as many possible points of resonance or reference within this web of interrelated types. So I show these two images really as a kind of analogy for the objective of the work. When one looks at these kind of complex layered patterns of the Islamic tiles or of Louis Sullivan ornament, one's vision is kind of restless and active. a figure emerges and then recedes again. The patterns are constantly shifting and layering, and these overlapping figures create a multiplicity of spatial and figural readings. So I think kind of situating architecture within a specific building culture locates it within this web of interconnected and coinciding patterns, past and present. And in this context, every type to which architecture can refer makes a sort of resonance where meaning and collective memory and emotion are evoked. If a building is able to resonate across many local types, from the formal to the structural to the material to the historical, then one's visual and experiential and cognitive mind is activated through a proliferation of association, almost like a kind of full experience of a Sullivan ornament. And it is through this layered resonance that I hope to make culturally specific architecture that's deeply embedded in and supportive of local building culture. So I'd like to begin with the kind of first project, a very old one for us, but one which I think very clearly sets out or demonstrates some of these ideas which I was just speaking about. And it's a house in the far west of Galway. This is Ireland, by the way. So the first project is a house out in the very far west of Ireland in a county called Galway. And really, as you move west in Ireland, the landscape, Ireland is kind of well known for its green landscape, but that green largely is not trees. Trees are quite limited, forests are quite limited on the island. And as you move west, the landscape becomes more and more rugged, more perhaps desolate isn't the right word, but certainly maybe barren, treeless. The environment itself, the weather is kind of ever present. And that's sort of, this image sort of encapsulates in a way the sort of west of Ireland. Maybe this image does so more, right? This is how trees grow in the west of Ireland when they grow in the west of Ireland, right? And the landscape is quite stony. So weather is ever present out there. Material resources are quite limited historically as well as today. And so several building types have emerged to sort of deal with these conditions, which we find throughout the country, but are maybe amplified in the West. And one of those building types is what I would call the traditional farmstead. We see this really throughout Europe, but it's ever present really in Ireland, where in these plans, the house is in black, and you would have a kind of very simple house, which is then surrounded by a series of barns or sheds, agricultural buildings, which form a series of courtyards or yards, which help to protect or create a microclimate really from this constant onslaught really. And this building typology is present historically, right, throughout the country. It's still very much used. This is not a building typology which has been abandoned and is no longer relevant. We find it everywhere and always active. So here, for instance, we see contemporary farms where we can see how these maybe older farmyards have evolved and added more single buildings that are one room deep to form a series of sheltered workyards. The other thing we notice from these plans is that really throughout the country that the sizes of the buildings tend to be the same, and this is a reflection of the material limitations. That traditionally there wasn't very much timber, and that therefore the skills for making roof structures with great spans or complicated roof structures that simply weren't there. So these buildings tend to be one room deep rather than multiple rooms deep, and tend to be limited in their overall depth to about 5 meters. And so rooms are added in sequence rather than in depth, essentially, right, in on-flood. Okay, so with this in mind, we were given this site in the far west near Loch Corrib, and the client was moving back home to the place where she had grown up after living away for many years. She grew up in this house, and many of these buildings existed, except there was this kind of growth of these sort of foreign, contemporary, kind of thoughtless bungalows, which really, to her, didn't have anything to do with where she grew up. So she was interested in making something which really reconnected her with her past. And so we find here, this is an existing building down here in the bottom, I hope you can see, which was one of these traditional farmhouses, right? Forming a sheltered courtyard facing south. And so our approach for the house, which we have right here, was simply to borrow this organizational type and to utilize it in a kind of contemporary setting. So our plan really followed all of those kind of rules, right? One room deep, rooms in sequence, forming a kind of sheltered courtyard facing south. And in this case, they were kind of interested in this kind of wild ruggedness of the field the building was going into, and that we might add a degree of rationality or abstraction by making that courtyard a perfect square, and then it might be kind of highly manicured versus the kind of more wild surrounding. So here we have, in a way, the two buildings sitting together. The farmhouse, which existed originally, is there on the left. Our finished proposal is there on the right. And as I say, I was interested in that the building sits in its landscape like this, I guess, where really you see it from a distance and it appears at first something quite familiar, something that, you know, if you'd grown up in that area, you wouldn't think was strange or unusual at all. But as you get closer to the building, that it starts to be both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, right? And that might draw you in. We have these kind of large chimneys, which I'll get to in a second. So that idea of a kind of web of points of resonance, again, starts to incorporate construction types. So out in rural areas, we often find this type of very rough concrete construction, often in stacked lifts. So kind of compacted concrete in layers. And in fact, the image on the left is again from right next to the site. The one on the right is from a mile away. And so I was interested that from a kind of construction point of view that we might refer to construction type, not simply form type or organizational type. So it resonates somehow with how ordinary buildings are built there. When it comes to that timber, this is a kind of photograph of a typical cottage building. And you can see that how rough exactly these types of constructions were. The timber is very unrefined, as close to straight out of the ground and into the building as possible, and the joinery is exceedingly primitive. And so to counteract the kind of poverty or the difficulty or frankly, the lack of quality in a roof structure, a lot of times throughout the 20th century, these buildings would tend to be tied around the top using these kind of concrete ring beams, which sort of bind the whole thing together. So in case the roof starts to fail and starts to push out horizontal thrust into these masonry walls, that the thing doesn't collapse, right? So they're bound together by a concrete ring beam. And we see that again in the left. This is that farmhouse just down the way I keep referring to. And we see that, right? It's got this kind of big concrete beam capping a kind of rough masonry wall, again, as a kind of insurance policy against roof failure. And so again, I was interested in how that structural system then might work, and that we could make our building with this sort of ring beam, which would go all the way around it. And our case, and that the roof structure then would be not restrain itself horizontally, right? That it would just go ahead from the outset, be an unrestrained rafter roof, and it would push that horizontal thrust out into the ring beam. And in our case, then it started to incorporate other things like gutters and lighting. So here's the kind of interior end project. And again, referring to the idea of this kind of very simple, basic roof structure, simply stained, and putting all of its horizontal force outwards into these deep ring beams surrounding the edges of the building. So if we look at kind of building types generally in the rural landscape, the two maybe vastly different but still related poles are on the one hand the kind of high manor house, right, which we see on the right, and then the kind of very basic vernacular house or cottage on the left. And really, again, these reflect the building culture of Ireland. Traditionally, the building culture of Ireland has been really restricted by a variety of factors. By its relative isolation at the edge of Europe, its building traditions have been influenced internationally, but a lot of times really through England. It's been limited by limited material resources, which I referred to before, lots of stone and clay, but no trees. By its relative poverty, especially throughout the 20th century, by its limitations in building skills, because a lot of the more highly skilled work people would have moved to England or America. And of course, by its rainy and cool climate. So these limitations have led, however, not to a lack of richness, but really instead simply limited the number of building typologies and the forms through which local character and a society is expressed. So we see here the kind of two poles, right? The kind of European influenced high Palladian manor house on the one side, the kind of basic vernacular building where stone arises out of the ground as a necessity for agriculture and then becomes used directly in building. But rather than the poles, I'm kind of more interested in the kind of blend of these two ends of things, you know? So where we have, for instance, the kind of cottage starts to become maybe more polite and to adopt some of the formalities of symmetry and proportion of the Palladian influence. And so starts to blend into a kind of manor house / cottage, or the high mannered houses start to be influenced by local construction techniques and a more basic, more poor interpretation of high architecture of Europe. And so it's really in this kind of rich melding that I think it's actually quite interesting. And so when it came to our kind of courtyard elevation, I was interested that it wouldn't be kind of purely vernacular reference point, that it might start to have some of this kind of high, well-proportioned, colonnaded reference as well. So that starts to inform, let's say, our courtyard elevation, which we see here and here. Here you can also see, I suppose, how that central courtyard is very precise and manicured, meeting this kind of wild surround. And this is another building which we just recently completed. We just got the photographs last week, so you probably haven't seen it unless you follow us on the Insta. But this is another building which refers to the same farmhouse typology. And in this case, we were actually, rather than referring to it, we were given one of these farmhouses as a starting point. As I say, they're still pervasive throughout the country. So this was what we were given to begin with. You can see in the bottom right image, this is the house on your right and the sheds on your left, and they do what I was describing before. They form this kind of sheltered courtyard of kind of gabled structures, very simply constructed in stone, and in this case, kind of cob earth construction. And a lot of times in the 20th century, the kind of traditional thatch would have been replaced with this corrugated iron oxide steel. So this is a plan of our proposal. What we were given was really this house here in its state you just saw, the shed here forming this courtyard. But there were a series of these. Can you guys see my mouse? Is that, yeah? Not if that's,
yes,
yeah,
we can
great,
see
okay.
it, and we are here.
Okay, good. I'm glad you haven't left. You know, I've only made it through one project. If you guys left now, I'd feel really bad about it.
We are here, yeah.
So we were given this house and stables. Stables existed along here, all of them in a more or less ruined state. And here we have a kind of mid-century barn like you saw in one of those earlier images. And so the idea here was that we would, instead of renovating the farmhouse, which tends to kind of kill off some of the quality of a ruin, that we would maintain the ruin as a ruin, but also maintain and support the original form and operate in the same internal logic that these buildings had always operated on, which was if we need additional space, we simply add another simple volume to provide that new space. So we slipped our new house essentially right in here between the gap between the ruined stables and the ruined house, forming another series of courtyards. And the strategy was then that all of the old ruined rooms would become garden rooms that each of the rooms of the house would look into, essentially. So we kind of maintain that character while supporting that formal type. So here we see it's in its completion just last week, set amongst all of its points. And here we see this idea of resonance, I think, across type, right? So it's organizational type, it's farmyard type. We see it also from a material point of view. Here we have a kind of very old corrugated roof, which we're picking up on the red, versus a mid-century one. The simple gable forms repeating, even down to, let's say, the proportion of the openings, which we found on site. But really, there's the meaning in the building, in my view, comes from referring out to as many of these points as possible at the same time. But there's also, I suppose, a kind of high contemporary, slightly abstracted point of view as well. You know, the detailing is crisp and minimal. So it kind of, as I said, looks forward and looks back perhaps simultaneously. Here you can see the ruin kind of more or less maintained as the ruin, and the old house with the shutters still on it. Our gable sitting in amongst this language of other gables. And draw your attention to this opening here, which have these kind of very simple timber lintels over top of them, which became the basis for our internal structure. And the idea really is the house is only ever read through or across or into all of the existing fabric. All of those courtyards are intended to be kind of heavily planted, so they're like very much garden rooms. It's kind of early here, I guess. In my view, the house is much better in 5 or 10 years' time when the greenery sort of takes over. But so you're looking through to the old stable building into one of the old stables. The trough is still there where the horses used to feed, and then you turn right. This was the old living and dining room of the original house. The original fireplace is behind me. We'll see that in a second. You can see I'm looking into then the master bedroom. And again, that kind of resonance about material. Here you get a hint through the end gable. There's a single column in our big room. And this is a kind of structural diagram, I suppose, of how it was to work. So all of the existing buildings, what was left when we removed the roof was a series of these kind of just gables were left standing. And so the idea was really that we would set out a regular interval of gable, that the roof would be utterly simple, ridge supported rafter roof. So we put in a steel beam as the ridge going from gable to gable to gable. And when we get to our big room, where we don't want a gable, we just prop it at the mid interval with a column. And then that we would make a kind of spatial interest or play or joyfulness perhaps by interposing this layer of plastered tented roofs, tented ceilings within each of the rooms that was kind of different in every room and sometimes responded to the pitch of the roof and sometimes had its completely own internal logic. So we see, for instance, in this section where we're going from the ruined building, the old bedroom, the old living room into our master bedroom where we have these kind of small tented roofs of the hall. Or in the long section where in the big room we ended up with this kind of very much a hipped tented ceiling, which is, you don't know until you arrive inside. Obviously outside the volume is utterly simple and feels very much ordinary, and inside you get this kind of play. Or that triangular oculus light which faces due south, which you saw in the gable, is actually delivering light right down a kind of half hip in the children's bedroom, which is this room. Here again, you see this point of resonance where we're looking out into the former courtyard, and you can see that the structure of all of the openings is the same and refers exactly to that one which is looking at right across the courtyard, where it's a very simple lintel, and that lintel sets out from a blockwork wall, and then the tents sort of sit down on that lintel structure. The walls are very roughly and kind of meant to be this sort of raw construction, like its context is, with just blockwork very lightly washed with a sand cement. The roof light here is lighting both the corridor and the bathroom at the same time. The budget on this house was quite meager, so we're doing as much as we can with as little as we can. Here's our sort of big tented room. Again, always looking, all the windows always looking into these ruins and courtyards around us. Here's in that master bedroom looking out to the former living room with the original cast iron stove still in its place in the chimney across. Okay, so I just want to quickly talk, I'm going to rush through a couple of these other projects just really quickly. So if the rural types are very few, the same could be said of the urban type. You know, the rural types are this kind of blend between manor house and cottage. with the occasional castle or tower house stuck in. Most city buildings are of a terrace type, tending to be 2 stories tall. And in places like Dublin, they tend to be made in brick traditionally. And in rural areas, they tend to have been built in stone and then lime washed. And I might just draw your attention here to, or lime washed or plastered. So I might just draw your attention here to this kind of shifting elevations, right? And it's certainly true throughout the country that where you might see something on the right, which might be kind of late Georgian, early Victorian building, you know, in places like England or Paris, these things would be very much about the front elevation and very much about establishing symmetry or ordered facades. In Ireland, the tendency is for the symmetry to be established internally. So, you know, these 2 windows would be symmetrically arranged around the internal room, but it means that then you get this constantly sort of shifting elevations, right? And which actually, in my view, is much more interesting and from an urban perspective, right? That the order between the floors is similar, but they're always slipping and sliding against each other. So we have here another example of that on the left, and our building for this kind of small community center in a rural town called Roscommon, where you can see we're sort of adopting this sort of language, right? Kind of tall rectangular proportioned openings, and that there is this kind of sliding based on how an internal symmetry does not necessarily result in any sort of symmetrical or ordered arrangement externally. It was in the context of the town's largest and most important church, so we're located right here. And so the idea really was that I was interested in it being absolutely quiet in a way, a very subtle building, setting into the background. And so that really the church could remain the most important thing there. You can see our site was the building on the right, and here it is after we've completed it, where, as I say, in some way it sort of disappears. And we see it here, I suppose, again, looking back against this typical terrace building that we find throughout these types of towns. And we see perhaps that it is at one point, from one perspective, exactly the same as them. And from another perspective, it's utterly different from them. Right? It again does this kind of looking forward and looking back sort of thing, borrowing some of the rules or ordering principles, but reinterpreting them perhaps in a contemporary way. And really kind of pushing, I guess, or I was interested in this idea of it being, you know, communicating in a very subtle way. So the rules are established by looking closely at the town, but then also it might play with that symmetry, and also that it would speak about the size of the room behind it. So the lintels are always shifting in their height for the windows based on the scale of the room behind it, because, you know, the windows want to be a certain size, for instance. The plan is quite simple. It's a series of counseling rooms and meeting rooms on the ground floor. This is the original building. Then when we go upstairs, sorry, this is one of the counseling rooms. Again, symmetrical orientation internally. We go upstairs and we arrive in this large meeting hall. And again, we then therefore have symmetrical orientations of openings internally, resulting in off-centeredness outside because of the need for fire stairs and kitchens and things like that. We adopted some of the, because it was established by a religious order, we adopted some of the iconography of the church nearby by having this kind of grandish dome. Again, off-centered though, and something you would have to discover in the building. There's no kind of evidence of that externally because it's off-centered, and the oculus is quite subtle roof light. So we see that play here, and I guess we see in a way the relationship between these two things, which are alike but different. Like maybe they're brothers, but not quite brothers. And so this question, I guess, it brings up this question to me of familiarity, right? That these forms hopefully would resonate with people from this area. You would immediately kind of recognize the forms, how the buildings work somehow, and that therefore the building and its how it works and how it looks takes on meaning through their common experience. In a way, all these projects are trying to create this sort of emotive architecture by connecting with this latent power, but trying to do so in a contemporary way. And while the approach, I suppose, is aiming for a sort of authenticity, the slippage away from like being like the ordinary, but slipping away from it somehow, draws the buildings towards perhaps the uncanny. And we tend to think about this term, the uncanny, as having something to do with haunted houses or Frankenstein or Edgar Allan Poe. But I think it can be pulled back from this sort of caricature. The implication of the ordinary and familiar in these materials and forms makes one comfortable, but at the same time, the slippage away from it, away from the expected, makes you slightly unsteady perhaps, or perhaps draws you into the building to ask questions like, I think I know what this is, but then again, maybe I don't. Some of these references or resonance points are more ephemeral, referring to general aspects of how things operate. But a lot of times it's like this, quite direct, right? Where we have one thing sitting right next to its reference point. And yeah, they're immediate maybe. And one of the common themes, I think, which is maybe evidenced here of the uncanny, is this interesting, perhaps, idea of the double. We tend to think of the idea of the double as a theme in film or in literature, this idea of like the evil twin or the cyborg or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But here I am again looking for a kind of direct resonance, sometimes immediate, sometimes distance, and where the double is useful to me because it gives you this kind of simultaneity of something known and something unknown, of a sort of type and its variant, of something past and something present, and that they're given a kind of equal footing at the same time. And they're both present somehow in each other, that we're not making new, which is destructive of the old, and trying somehow to supersede it. These two things are intertwined together somehow. Bruce Banner is the Hulk, and he is also not the Hulk at the same time. So I have a sort of few examples of this. Obviously, things I've shown already have this sort of idea of the double within them. We do a lot of these kind of projects, which are extensions of houses in Dublin. And again, I'm always trying to develop a contemporary language, which is quite closely related or emerges out of the thing it is attached to. And so you can see here, this is a Victorian house that we've extended to the rear, and the language is derived from its origins, right? From the windows to the idea of this timber beam to the collection of different forms above and below. It is somehow a double. Or this house, mid-century, quite typical Dublin housing with plaster and this kind of plaster banding. Again, being somehow like it, and the whole architectural language emerges out of it. Or this is a competition we did, or it wasn't a competition actually, it was an invited publication we did where we were invited to the sort of thought experiment of extending John Soane's Dulwich Museum. And again, we did so by kind of making this idea of the double on either side of its very long central form. Or this project, which is a competition we won ages ago and we're actually still working on. This is one of the most important, historically important terraces in Dublin. That was really one of the richest, most important streets when it was constructed, then became a sort of quite poor and derelict, and now is kind of being reinvigorated. You'll see here, it was these kind of Georgian palaces, and this building was our site at the end of this, where there used to be like these ones, 4 bays, and the building went derelict and they knocked down the last 2 bays. Up here, we might notice that this building was built as a 18th century, late 18th century library for a law society. And when it needed to be extended in the 19th century, the architect made a very subtle step and adopted the language of really the street, right, and of this building by just adding these kind of simple repetition of windows. And so our site was to approach the opposite end of this terrace somehow and to extend that Georgian building. The interesting thing about that extension at this end is that when you go around the corner then, after this extremely subtle step back, the architect adopted a late 19th century, nearly Louis Sullivan style language around the side that it somehow became contemporary around the corner. So again, this idea of like looking forward and looking back and adopting the kind of approaches that exist already, we decided to approach the opposite side of that terrace in the same sort of way. So we reestablished the order of the street with these sort of blind windows, which acknowledge that building is not there anymore, that's gone somehow, with a very subtle re-entrant corner. And then we make this sort of language which is our own, but also referential to the opposite side of that terrace, with these kind of brick walls. So as I said, this idea of the double or quite direct reference, a lot of times I do like it to read like immediately adjacent, right? Immediately apparent somehow. But in this project, I was interested in the double somehow reading at a distance, perhaps. But it might be more of a kind of conceptual grounding for the project. And so in this case, we were constructing or proposing to construct a double that was across the country, directly, in fact, nearly on the same latitude line as its referent, but on diametrically opposite sides of the country. And so we were given this site in this small town called Clifton, which is in the far west, even more, I'll come back to it again, but more rugged, barren landscape. This is the kind of last outpost before you hit America. Is Clifton, and we were given this site on a river, which was a floodplain, and there was one high point in the floodplain where we were going to be able to build. And the town at this point is starting to expand really and become suburban and starting to surround that floodplain. So if we built there, whatever we built would remain this kind of singular object within a floodplain landscape, and so it would always be a sort of island. And so it got me thinking, I suppose, about this kind of traditional object in the landscape, the idea of the folly, or in this case, the idea of a building that I knew because it's an amazing building and it's very close to my office, but also because it was constructed as a folly in a landscape and has now been surrounded by suburbia. So it was built as a garden folly and pleasure pavilion in the landscape garden of a important manor house for the Earl of Charlemont. The house is now gone, but thankfully the pleasure pavilion, the casino at Marino, it's called, survives right here in the middle, now surrounded on all sides by inner suburban Dublin. And so it is and will always be this sort of island within this type of landscape. And so I was thinking really that our project would end up that way as well, right? And so it could be thought of as, having its brother on the opposite side of the country. This building is really an amazing thing because its apparent simplicity externally belies an extremely complicated and clever and ingenious and amazing interior with many sort of, I suppose, tricks and things to discover about it. It looks from the outset like it's a single-story building with probably one big room in it, and then it's symmetrical in both directions, right? But when we look at its section, we see, in fact, that it's a three-story building, that there is a service area in the ground floor. We have reception rooms in the lower ground floor or basement, reception rooms at a ground floor, and that we have this first floor, in fact, which is kind of private sleeping chambers. When we look at the plan, again, of course, it's not one room. In fact, it's many rooms. And, there's this kind of service zone in the middle. We have a kind of entrance hall, the big reception room, a kind of reading or smoking room on either side. And what's amazing about it is the architect, who is William Chambers, his control about, for instance, if we look at the windows, that the window is appropriate to the size of the overall volume externally and about addressing the landscape. And so for a big room, that large window starts to make sense. But for smaller rooms, that room would be too big. The proportion of it would be too big. So behind the glass, he scales down the size of the window to suit the proportion of the room that it's going into. So he covers part of the window externally. Or here, where he's covering part of the window to control the proportion here, but allowing a small chink of light into the stair hall. So it's kind of ingenious in kind of many ways. The first floor plan looks like this, and again, so he could have light come into the building without showing that there was a third floor or having those windows externally. The windows are all hidden behind the parapets and look into these kind of small courtyards, essentially at a first floor level, get their light from these little light wells. And then those are drained through downpipes in the corners, which run down the 4 corner columns and are collected in basins in the basement for use. So ingenious from many, many, many ways. Sorry, one last thing about its ingenuity. So this is one of those big windows, right? Addressing the landscape, appropriate for the large room and for the landscape. Behind this, which you can just sort of make out here, there's a false wall here to scale down the window to suit the room on the other side. You can't see that when you're looking at the building externally, in part because they obviously painted the back of that wall black. But this extent of their control is really astounding because every pane of glass in this window is slightly curved and angled slightly to aim upwards towards the sky so that it reflects the sky, not the darker ground, so that you see light instead of seeing through to the wall behind. So we're talking extraordinary skill here. I'm going to show you something that is not as good as that now, which is the thing we did. But you can see, I suppose, across country here that here are the brothers, right? The idea of this double, the idea of these objects in a landscape. Ours is raised up on this plinth to get it out of the floodplain, and again has this idea, I suppose, that it appears symmetrical, appears to have windows which do one thing but don't actually do that. So the client was interested in having curves. I was quite uncomfortable with that. In fact, it was really the only request was that she got curves. I was pretty uncomfortable with that, I guess, at the time, having been educated at a purely rational perspective. And so I tried to give her structural curves and section, and she said, no, Ryan, I need curves and plan. I want curved walls inside and outside, so just deal with it. So thought if I couldn't do that, then I shouldn't be in the business. So so we end up with this kind of rational rectangle, which then has the corners removed from it. And the idea really is then that those curves become kind of tied to the structure and tied to the light somehow. So the structure is really that we have beams going from the corner of a curve to the opposite corner, the corner of a curve to the opposite corner, and that we have this central block of kind of service and stairs and things, and that the threshold between rooms then is not doors, it's a pinch point between a rectangular form and a curved form. So you come in through the center here, you arrive overlooking the floodplain, and then as you move through, you get this kind of threshold pinch point, which tightens around depending on the size of the room, really. Here, Stefan predicted what I already had in my lecture, which is being able to look at these things side by side, right? So that they're somehow family. There's a bit of Villa Emo in both of our plans, actually. I think we both borrowed heavily about this kind of piece of service, about it being carved somehow, and about how that sets up the proportion of the rooms to the garden side versus a kind of street side. But okay, on the first floor, again, it works similar to, in some ways, to the casino. It's a kind of matrix of interconnected rooms where the light comes through the corners. In this case, though, the light comes into the rooms through the corners here, but then also we have this double height space in the corners, which then brings light down into the ground floor. So in this kind of worm's eye view here, you can see here's the curves, the beams land on the curves at the points, making this cross structure. And in the gap, the light comes in at these corner windows, allowing soft light to come down through the gap between beams and curves, which ends up sort of looking like that. Here's one of those kind of threshold points, I guess. Okay, so I suppose one of the other themes, which is pretty persistent. How are we doing on time here? I'm talking too much. I'm going to speed up through the end.
I would just like to take advantage of this moment and to tell everybody, if you have questions, you can drop them in the chat area. and then at the end I will read them. I will pass them on. So please do.
Great. Yeah. Okay, so just a couple of notes about structure, and then I'll finish. I think there's maybe 2 more projects. So, you know, structure, as you've seen, maybe is extremely important in our work. And to me, if like a lot of it is, a lot of the work is looking at this very close reading of local morphology, that the structure somehow to me starts to point outwards at something more universal, right? Things which are true for us in Ireland and everywhere, really, that the structure is a sort of statement of fact. But that I'm interested really in the experience of that fact, that like that statements of that fact and tuning structure gives a kind of an emotive effect, perhaps. And that somehow structure can also make some of these forms, which are referential in their core, can make them somehow seem inevitable. They have a tendency to kind of push very hard against anything which seems designed. We'd say it often in the office. I'd say that looks too designed, and everyone knows like we need to move away. So in this project, which is again another rural site in Carlo, we were given this. We tend to be given things which are hideous. This is an awful thing we were given, which is really a condition that building the landscape is pretty limited, and so people tend to have houses or buy houses that then they can extend rather than being able to build a new house, for instance. So in this case, this house is trying to be like a cottage, but it's all of the most awful caricatures of that, right? It's got these kind of funny corner coins and this porch and these, you know, one of these chimneys is fake. So the idea really was to extend and again, to kind of connect to some of the more prevalent things. The area that this was in was in a hilly area. And so these types of vernacular buildings tend to organize in courtyards still, but do so in a looser form that tends to follow the contours. So we get things like this, which snoodle a bit. So here's our kind of site plan really away. This is the existing house, which we are stripping back to its sort of bare bones, really its basic form of a simple pitched roof volume. And then we added this piece, which then oriented the main rooms of the house towards this view of a mountain in the distance, and then extended these walls to the bout borders to get this sort of series of protected zones. Here again, its brother or its double from a couple of miles away. On the left, you see, on the left of this image, you see the existing house stripped back and our extension here, and this idea of maybe extending the eaves to provide a sheltered zone underneath. But really, I was interested about like, you know, is this form, I'm always being highly critical of myself and wondering if, is this form a kind of caricature or is it still valid somehow? And I think, you know, I've arrived really that it's valid for a lot of reasons. One is that idea of a kind of collective memory, that it has this resonance with people, that these kind of simple pitched roof, single room deep forms have this meaning to everyone who lives here. But also they're still exactly the way that we were constructing things in Ireland. There's still, the weather is still the same. Don't let the sun right now fool you. The material availability is the same. We look at this cottage built in probably the 1800s. It's a masonry wall construction. It's a simple rafter roof or an A-frame rafter roof. The timber in that building likely was imported from Scandinavia, even in the 1800s. And it's one room deep because it's the simplest structure. And here we have a contemporary house built to meet all the contemporary regulations. And we see it's virtually the same in its construction. There's a cavity, yes, but it's a masonry wall construction. The timber is still coming from Scandinavia or Central Europe and is imported. The structures are quite similar. And so really this type of construction and these forms endure because the conditions which gave rise to them continues to endure. So here, when we essentially for our extension, we adopted the exact pitch, the ridge height, the form of what we were given and just doubled it. You know, there are ideas playing off the windows. Maybe we have these kind of hung windows, which are, you know, dangled from the edge of the eaves. But really, I was interested in this idea of making a really primitive structure. And so the structure in this building is again a ridge-supported rafter roof. But in this case, we interposed. Actually, it's this one really in the end, which is that it's a ridge supported on 2 columns, but one of those columns lands on a tie beam. and that tie beam helps to resist the horizontal thrust, binds that simple roof together in a kind of primitive and really direct way. And so there are local references here, right? The cottages and farms again. There are universal references or resonances with this kind of pure expressive structure. There's direct high architecture references. It's very much relating to Shinohara's Tanikawa house. And unfortunately, I couldn't make my room full of earth, but someday. So essentially, we didn't do much inside the house. You come into the big room here that we made, which is in these 4 bays. One post lands on a tie beam, and then you have an external porch and a kind of wine area, and a small room up above. There's that simple ridge. So yeah, it speaks quite directly, I suppose, and oftentimes we're talking about maybe tuning structure, that we would take maybe standards like, you know, the fact that you would put a joist at, you know, 400 spacings, 40 centimeter spacings or 60 centimeter spacings, and in fact that's not so emotively strong, and so we thin them out to be very slender rafters and pull them together to be only 250 mils, so it really feels more like a texture than a series of elements. And we'd counterpose the texture or the pattern versus things which become more figural, let's say. Again, to kind of tune up the emotive power of the structure. We're of course playing it off of light. Okay, so formal endurance because of structural and constructional endurance, and then structure relating somehow to a kind of idea of tuning the character of spaces, and for that sort of emotive effect, I guess, is what I'm speaking about here. But really, this idea about maybe exploring structure and what more it can do than solve simple structural problems, how the structure itself might resonate with reference points, or perhaps maybe what I would refer to it as responsive structure, let's say, is what I've written here, where a structure might respond to context and might do more than a single role. So in this case, we have this kind of simple supported rear facade with these kind of structural columns, which of course refer to the symmetry of the original building in this extension in Dublin. And again, this idea of kind of figure and a pattern that you saw in the last project. And inside the project was given this angled ring beam onto which all of the ceiling joists sat. But that ring beam isn't just a structural idea, it's about referring to the High Georgian house, which it's attached to, which has in every room this kind of cornice line running around it. So in this case, we get a kind of cornice, which is structure, right? So structure is responding somehow to its context, or arising from a reading of its context. Or in this case, where I was interested in having this column be as slender as possible, so we have the engineer defined size, but we had to hold a wall which required a thicker beam above, and so it just has this kind of slight response, I suppose, to these two different conditions. A moment of joy, perhaps. Or in this case, where the two beams internally allow us to create a sunken area in the roof to form the gutter, which then comes outside and the structure deforms to make a hopper to catch the rain to pull down. So this idea of, I guess, a responsive structure, I would call it. So in this case, I want to talk about two more reference points in one last project. So this is one of the country's most important Palladian mansions called Russborough House here. And it's a really beautiful thing. I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'm interested in this in the field, which is a 19th century circular building called a ride. And it was a response to the environment, really, right? That people, aristocrats who lived in this building might want to ride their horses for take their daily air or exercises or go for a walk under cover. And so they made this circular building, which is just for walking or for riding your horse in. It looks like this. in the field. And internally, it looks like this. So it has a series of cast iron columns which come down, and you would ride around under cover. And of course, it's to provide shelter. But those simple structural elements then have this double or a multiplicity of uses, and it's so amazingly executed. We have the gutter collecting water here. At every column, we have this small connection piece which brings the water into the column and drains it down until it hits this octagonal granite piece at the bottom, which gets the cast iron out of the ground to prevent it from rusting. It doesn't end there though, because then the water comes out of this little hole in the side of the granite, drips down and into this small cup where the horses can drink it before it then drains away into a central cistern underneath the center of the thing. So someone has taken what could be just a completely ordinary building and taken its base requirements of structure and circularity and then turned them into this whole other amazing poetic responding to the pervasive weather here. And so this is an amazing thing to me. And so we'll hold that one in our mind for a second. And we'll also look at this thing which my friend Andrew Clancy refers to as the casual buttress. And so if you think about a structural buttress, which resists horizontal movement in walls and usually resists horizontal thrust in a roof pushing outwards. And we think about it in terms of cathedrals, right, or where it's planned from the outset that this is how the horizontal thrust will be dealt with. It'll be dealt with outside the building rather than inside the building through triangulation. But in rural constructions in Ireland, a lot of time there isn't this kind of forethought, and we know from before about that the timber is often failing and pushing out on these walls. So when that starts to happen, we get things like this, right? Buttresses which are added casually after the fact to solve structural problems. So there's sort of a post facto structural solution. This one's one of my favorite ones. These are 2.5 meter single pieces of granite, which someone had lying around to save their wall from falling over. But we see it everywhere, right? We see it in corners and we see it at midpoints and we see it, yeah, casually applied wherever there starts to be structural failure. So again, another type perhaps of responsive structure. And so with this idea of kind of buttress and the rain, we move one more time out to the edge of the earth, out to the landscape in Connemara past Clifton. The road out to there, I can't recommend enough that everyone drive this road. It's absolutely amazing. Looks like this. The weather is constantly changing. They say 4 seasons in a day is the common phrase, and it's absolutely true. So the light is amazing, the colors are amazing. It's fantastic, but you kind of leave society behind, right? If Ireland is a kind of distant edge of Europe somehow, the further you go to the west, the more you feel like you're moving back in time somehow, and really at the edge of the earth by the time you get to Clifton. So you pass through Clifton. Here it is again, looking back at that landscape, and then we leave that behind for this kind of extremely barren, windswept connection with the Atlantic, where really the next thing is America. Or it might lead you to believe the earth is flat and out there there's like dragons or something. Okay, so our site here is again on the edge of the earth, and again we were given something horrible to deal with. So the tendency again is people buy these things for the sites, but then they can't knock them down. So we end up having to kind of remake them into a single project, right? Rather than adding an extension, which just ignores everything that's there. I think it's more interesting to try to find a language between new and old and to remake the old into a kind of a unified singular project that may have been built at one time. So we were given this horrible thing. And our proposal was to take off its roof, to add an extension, which is this, the original house is under here. This is actually an old diagram. We haven't, again, this one, we actually photographed it last week. I don't have those photographs. So what you're going to see here is phone photographs and construction photographs. So please excuse me here. And we haven't done any presentation drawings. So it's all what I had lying around, I put into this for us. So this is an old presentation, but essentially, the old house is here. We're re-roofing that old house. We're adding an extension here to form this kind of sheltered courtyard, which really you need this sheltered courtyard out here. And And that then we're trying to make the internal structure as light as possible, as open and fine, and in a way weak as possible, and putting all of the horizontal force externally into a series of concrete buttresses which run around the outside of the building. So here's our kind of end site plan. The sea is right, the ocean is right down here, sloping down away from us. The existing house here has been re-roofed. We have this kind of connection element here, and then the extension, which is largely like a big room for living and dining and kitchen and connecting out to the landscape. And then we trap this protective sheltered courtyard in the center of it all. The client for this was the same client, so of course we have the curves again. So the plan of this is the existing house we didn't mess with too much. So you know, it's not ideal really. It's a big long corridor with lots of bedrooms off of it, but we weren't able to do much about that. We added these elements out here, the kind of connection element, the big room, which is really like a sort of hall in a way, and has this sort of, because of the buttresses, the reference to kind of church architecture. And so we added these two curves into it as sort of almost side chapels nearly. One gets you this sort of bench area looking out towards the view. The other one gets you a fully enclosed pantry for the kitchen, and sit as these kind of objects within the room. And you can see then we have 12 of these structural buttresses all the way around, working externally. Again, the reference points you now know, right, about farmhouses, about corrugated, about the red. This is a construction shot, but I'm afraid it was not really the only shot that I had currently, which gives you the kind of full picture. So this is the remade existing house here on the right, our extension then in the distance, the connection piece here, which gets us this sheltered entrance. And so this kind of low sloping piece steps up just at the point where the door in is. And we start to get a hint here about how the structure becomes responsive to the environment. So all of the roofs oversailed to get you covered areas externally, so that when a shower comes, you can duck underneath. And then the structure of the buttresses also carry the gutters in them. The downpipes then go into each of the buttresses and come out at the bottom of them. I'll show you here in a second. So here we see the entrance again, looking back. And so these sheltered areas also then get heavily planted. So again, like the first and second project I showed you, my idea really is that it gets to be overgrown somehow in between each of these structural elements. The gutter on this side is quite low, so it's below eye level for most of that side. And you can see we also went to a whole lot of trouble to suspend the gutter, because when the rain hits these corrugates, the water gets funneled into the little valleys, and so it comes off in these very small rivulets. And so we wanted to express that. So I always refer to this project as making space for rain. And so we separated the roof from the gutter so that you internally and everywhere, you always get to see all these little rivulets come off and catch the light and things like that. So this is talking a little bit about the space for rain. This is the thing that makes me happiest. I got to make a flying buttress where the buttress is disconnected from the body of the building, and you can kind of slip around maybe it's a stretch to call it a flying buttress, but you can slip around through the kind of corner buttress, which takes all the horizontal force out of the internal roof. Here you can see how it works maybe a bit, that the rain comes down, drops into the gutters drain into a concealed downpipe in the buttress. It comes out at the bottom and then is caught in these little gullies at the bottom, very much like that Rusborough house reference I showed you before. Here again, you can see one of those moments. So the space for rain is really a kind of celebration of rain. I was with the client out there just last week when we were photographing, and she was saying her daughter looks forward to, in Ireland where everyone's complaining about the rain all the time, and in the west of Ireland where it's raining all the time and everyone's like, oh, the weather. she said that actually she looks forward to it raining in the house because the house somehow comes alive at that moment, right? That suddenly outside of every window, we're seeing these things. The sound on the corrugate happens. We can watch the water coming out of the bottom. Here's the kind of construction shot of the buttress ready to take the gutter. Here's a highly complicated detail, but just to show you, I suppose, about these kind of big eaves beams which take that thrust of the roof, which is then puts that horizontal force into the buttresses. The buttresses taking the gutters, coming down and out again. And internally, what we get, the internal structure is really this very light timber structure with no horizontal resistance to anything. These are some of the construction drawings we made of the buttresses, of which there are 12. And of course, unfortunately, every one is slightly different. So it wasn't easy. This is inside the courtyard where there's one buttress taking almost all of the rain in the courtyard, again, drops off, comes around into this buttress, comes down, drains out at this point, and then goes into this kind of central contemplative pond element. And this, actually, it's really amazing how sheltered this is. When you cross through the threshold to stand outside, you might be completely battered by the wind. And in here, it's always exactly peaceful. Internally, you get an idea, I suppose, of this kind of big room, which is this kind of slightly cathedral-like thing with extremely fine timber construction. And then at a lower level, we wrapped it in this kind of plaster, which came up to window lintel level. And that plaster kind of slips along the edges and then pulls out because it's a free and more plastic form to make the kind of curves on either side. So we have the pantry on the right, and we have this kind of seating area looking at the view on the left. And we have an amazing carpenter who prefabricates all of these elements, and every element, every rafter, every joist is dovetailed into all of its neighbors. So all pre-cut offsite and dovetailed in absolutely precisely. Here you're looking back out at the landscape and that buttress. And this contrast, I suppose, between the kind of plastic element and the constructural or structural element. There's inside the other chapel or apse. And the whole building was really about the kind of joy of these sort of elements. I don't have all the photographs, but every single gully of the 12 buttresses is different. So we had fun in the office making all of these styrofoam models for the builder to put into the casts. And so when I get the photographs back from the photographer, you'll see them all. But we started with simple things like these upside down ziggurats, and then we went into kind of more complex shapes. And there's simple spheres. There's 12 different variations, I suppose, on the theme. And I'll just end with a couple of videos. So if maybe I'm hoping you'll hear this, but I don't. You might let me know if you do or not. Do you hear it?
No.
Sounds great to me. It's too bad. No? Well, anyways, you can kind of see, anyways, at least the light coming through, the kind of rivulets coming off the roof here. Or here where, again, like the gutter is set into the wall and then disappears, and then it comes back out again for this larger gully, and I'm hoping this will all go very green as it stores the water or holds it for a little bit. Or here with our courtyard. Okay, that's all.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much for the beautiful and dense presentation. And I'm very happy that you have accepted our invitation. It is, I think it's gathering up to what we have been discussing earlier with our students about the attention of how to see what is there before us in terms of architecture and landscape and culture. And it's amazing what you have shown us, how to see things which, I mean, are there, you know, put there by previous generations and architects. And you have at length talked about these things. I wanted also to underline them again about the unfamiliarity of things. And I was looking to the beautiful way in which your built objects, your built architecture has a certain presence, and I would say very intellectual, modest, and very part of that place. And yet, when you go inside, given the section and how you work with all the details, the construction and the finishings, it reveals its true force and spatiality. And
Thanks.
I wanted to say that. Um, we have a few questions, and I would like to ask them if you still have the force to.
Yeah, of course, please. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Feel free,
So
everybody.
yes. So we have from Vlad a question regarding the first project you presented, the one in Galway. I'm reading this now.
Sure, go ahead.
How does the client use the courtyard? I ask this because I see those types of courtyards as a result of the need to shelter things that could not be kept inside the main house, such as animals, grains, plows, tractors. Wow, it's a long question. Therefore, traditional households have this form for a real reason specific to their retirement activities. Are we eligible to borrow and to use these typologies when their functions basically disappear?
Yeah, I take your point that a lot of those yards were used for agricultural purposes as opposed to leisure purposes. Actually, typically there would have been a kind of formal front garden that would actually be a kind of garden put forward to the street. And then the other yards created by those buildings, or courtyards created by those buildings, would be more rough and dirty and agricultural. So there traditionally also would have been one that was more like a lawn or a recreational garden, right, to sit in, for instance. So yeah, maybe it's not used agriculturally, but the reason for it being there is for shelter, right? That it's extremely windy, it's rainy all the time, and that when you make a kind of south-facing, well-protected courtyard, you raise the ambient temperature and you make it possible to sit outside. And so the desire to sit outside or to work outside, the only difference here is whether we're sitting outside for recreation or whether we're working outside. The fact is still that for human beings, being in that sort of sheltered environment when you're in the west of Ireland is a strong preference, right? And so because the environment has stayed the same and humans are the same, I think the need for the sheltered courtyard remains the same. It doesn't, you know, they didn't make those courtyards for the cows or their tractors. They made those courtyards to make it comfortable to work in, comfortable to live in. And so that, especially in those environments in the West, we still need to do that when we can, I think. Yeah, so I guess, and I'm very conscious and very self-critical about, you know, when I'm making these reference points to try to not to be nostalgic somehow, that I only address these points if I feel like they're still relevant to contemporary life, you know? So if there's some aspect which, you know, doesn't pertain to us or seems anachronistic, then I do my best to leave it behind. But I also don't deny things which are historical when their reason for being is still true, which is why I also still, you know, say the courtyard is important, you know, or that these forms of simple gable buildings still make sense because the construction methodology, the construction skills, the material availability, these things endure still. They're basically the same. So when the reason for being still endures, then I think it's perfectly valid to make use of these things. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, I think you have. I'm moving on to the other two questions.
Sure, yeah.
Regarding the same project in Galway from Cesar. How do you manage to tackle the thermal breaks? Of course, if any layer of thermal insulation is present, especially at the position of the concrete ring beam, which is visible both from the interior and the exterior of the house.
Yes, people always worry that I'm making a bunch of cold bridges, which is, of course, unethical at this point. But no, yeah, there's always cold bridges. I mean, sorry, there's always insulation. There are not cold bridges. Sorry, there are no cold bridges. Essentially, in that project in Galway, the one with the big chimneys, we poured two beams. There's an internal beam and an external one, and they're connected across insulation with, there's lots of different ways to do it. We did it in a very rough way out there with just pulling the rebar through. But actually the trick of that project is that the big part of the beam is internal on one side and external on the other side. And the big part of the beam really is doing the work. So on the one side, it's the internal piece, which is doing the work, resisting that horizontal thrust, taking the load of the roof. On the other side is the external. And so in a way, we're telling the story that it's one, but it's always two, and they do work together.
Yes, this is a great theme, the great lies in architecture that Snotty used to talk about, Vakini's lies, and also Kirsten Gers. And now a final question from Emil. And Emil, my colleague, if you feel the desire to intervene, please do. How can you explain the preference for the uncanny, for the double, in contrast with the idea of authenticity, the unique? This comes in continuation with the interior debates we have on this notion and theory of the double.
Yeah, tricky question from Emil. I don't know. They're opposed to each other, I guess. On the one hand, we have this search for something authentic, which I suppose to me the only way to make that connection to a place, to local life, is to try for it to be as authentic as possible, right? That it's true somehow, or it gets at true things. That it's not just a show. It's not done with a tongue in cheek. I'm not trying to be witty or clever. I'm trying as much as possible to be honest about it, right? And so that's the authenticity sort of drive, right? And there's a whole hour-long discussion we could have about that probably. And to me then the question of the double really is about, well, lots of things. One, that really we do feel like we have, I'm somehow certainly apart from this, right? Authentic world. You know, I'm an American, for Christ's sake, living in Ireland and analyzing these things from a world I did not grow up in, right? And so I am sort of somehow other, but trying to make that authentic connection. So we have these kind of two things set up to begin with. We also have the fact that we're in a contemporary world, which is somehow different. So I think the double, and somehow if you're trying to make an authentic approach, it's unavoidable. And so then I think once you accept that, then using the double to draw people in, and I'm always kind of conscious, I suppose, of trying to connect to, I always refer to them as ordinary people. And I mean, just non-architects, right? People who are not gallerists, people who are not art collectors. You know, all of my clients have pretty ordinary budgets. They're like retired bank managers and teachers and county council people. You know, these aren't people who are seeking out, you know, their $1 million art collection or something, you know. And so I'm very conscious, I suppose, of how to connect to ordinary people and to give them an architectural experience, I guess, right? That they would start to value. And I think the double then is, and the uncanny is useful in that way, right? If you present someone with something which is simply foreign or simply outrageous, they have a singular, you know, on or off response to it, right? It's good, it's bad. It's exciting for a second, and then, you know, I don't know how to access it. And so the double does that thing, and the uncanny does that thing of the unhomely, right? That it draws one in, right? It asks you to say, I'm familiar, I understand the language, but wait a minute, it's something different. And I'm drawn in to kind of interrogate that a little bit. And if I can keep doing that over and over again, like, oh, that's familiar, then it's unfamiliar over and over again with this authentic thing. And then, you know, but outside of that kind of authentic reference point, to me, that's how I can hopefully have a conversation with, yeah, ordinary people, right? Not architects, not gallerists, not art collectors. So I don't know that they're diametrically opposed ideas, I guess. I think within my kind of construct, they're definitely related to each other. If Emil wants to add anything or push on that, I'm happy for him to push on that.
Okay. Emil, do you want to add something up?
Emil's keeping it simple.
Okay. Yes, one
Hello,
last.
sorry. I didn't know that I can use the mute unmute button. So I understood that we only had to chat. Thank you very much for your presentation and the convincing answer as well. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I have one final short question before my final closing argument. I wanted to ask you, have I seen rightly, do you use hand drawing in your project as a tool to because I have seen part of the presentation drawings you have put forward that seem to me both a mixture of computer drawings and hand drawings, and they seem beautiful. And I wanted to ask you how do you use this classic tool?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting at my desk in the office, and if I just pull things off the desk, you know, we have some of this, or while I'm talking on the phone, there's lots of that, and we're combining them with, combinations of, computer drawings and hand drawings. So certainly, I find it invaluable, and actually the more that I get on in age and the more I deal with people, the ability to hand draw and to communicate with them and myself very quickly, it's absolutely essential. I don't care what kind of Jedi you are with the Rhino. It's just not the same, and it's not maybe as quick and communicative and thinking through drawing that you can do by hand. So all my early work in any project is by hand. As I'm communicating with people in the office, I'm always drawing by hand. And then, of course, we're also using all the techniques of contemporary practice, AutoCAD and Rhino models and things like this. And a lot of times, I guess, we would very early in projects, there'd be key moments where I'm trying to have that kind of connection with the client or the viewer or something like that, right? To make that kind of powerful architectural moment. And so we would set up those kind of points of perspective very early in a project. We'd make basic Rhino models or SketchUp models or things like that, just to set up that point. And then I'll do like hundreds of sketches over top of that point, right? So that I'm tuning it and changing it and tuning it and changing it, drawing over the kind of bones of the project, I guess. Doing variation after variation after variation by hand, but again, in dialogue with the computer model somehow. And then in the office, we pin those up, and we have this kind of door here. You can see. We have, this is our office, a nice old Georgian building in Dublin. And we have that door there, which is takes tape pretty well. So kind of fill that whole door with variations of views drawn over and over and over again, and have a discussion in the office about what works and what doesn't. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you for the time and for the passion of the presentation. And I want
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to add that what I missed telling at the beginning, that Ryan Kennihan and Robert Verist from Architecture Brio from Mumbai and probably Neven Fuchs will be part of the guest jury at the end of the 6 weeks project in our studio. For sure, next Wednesday, we will have Robert Verist from Rotterdam talking about his practice in Mumbai. And I also want to say that tomorrow evening in the portico of our university, we launch the issue 6 of our magazine, Mazzocchioo, based on the work of our students from last year, going to depth into the high schools and schools in the center of Bucharest. So maybe with much attention and social distancing, we can meet a few minutes, an hour in the portico tomorrow at 6 p.m. Thank you, Ryan, again, and thank you everybody for being here. Almost 100 students and teachers. Thank you very much for being here. And if you feel like it, we'll be here next Wednesday again, and in 6 weeks' time again.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks everyone for coming along.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Talk to you soon.